hurts me the most is for two patients to accuse me of giving another patient's medication that was not ordered.
When we leave our loved ones under the medical care of others, we expect them to be treated with kindness, professionalism, and even some form of love. Imagine though for a moment what you would do if your special person came to harm, and even worse, if it wasn't by accident. This is Dark Case Serial Killers. Viewer discretion is advised for this educational documentary. Welcome back to Dark Case Documentaries. I bring you true crime, disturbing stories and other things that you may later regret knowing with regular uploads every week. Please do join the quickly growing, incredibly supportive Dark Case family by hitting subscribe now and turning on notifications. Remember, choosing to be kind can save a life in many ways. Thank you so much for choosing to be here with me. Our love and respect goes out to all those affected by this case. Clara Strange and Thelma Metcalf were two friends, but they doubled as dialysis patients at the DeVita Lufkin Dialysis Centre. They had met at the care facility and quickly became buddies as their grueling days at the centre dragged on. Clara was 77 years old and known as a sweet, loving woman. She devoted her life to her husband, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She was also dedicated in her career as a teacher at Lufkin State School. This was an educational facility for intellectually disabled students. Clara also made time for herself, enjoying quilting, cooking, and any adventure that she could muster up the strength to participate in. She was lovingly known by her family as an easygoing adventurer, a combination I think we can all aspire to. It is no surprise that Clara got along so well with 68-year-old Thelma, who was virtually no different. Thelma's family members called her a loving jokester, a mother and grandmother who was also up for any adventure that came her way. She was extremely social, always going to some type of group, class or party, so long as her physical strength could keep up. Thelma didn't want to let her age or her health problems stop her from experiencing life, so she did the best she could to live every day to the fullest. Thelma had a long history of both diabetes and hypertension. These both began to affect her social life as they worsened. Even though it was difficult for her to adjust, Thelma's family was extremely supportive as she experienced declining health. Her daughter-in-law was doing her best to care for her as she was a registered nurse. However, once Thelma's condition began to affect her kidneys, it was obvious that she needed help that her family just could not provide. As it became abundantly clear that Thelma needed to start dialysis, she lost hope in her ability to ever do things that she loved again, including her bustling social life. Even though she was missing out on what she used to have, Thelma was pleasantly surprised at the community she found when she began her visits to DeVita. With friends like Clara and nurses that made her feel like part of her family, it was easier for her to cope with the loss of social interaction that she used to have. Her family was delighted at first because when Thelma had to visit the centre every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, she continued to feel more and more at home in the family she found at DeVita. She was so pleased with the emotional and social treatment that she was receiving that she was happy to ignore her family's concerns about the quality of her physical treatment. Thelma experienced a lot of setbacks during her time at DeVita, way more than what is typical of a dialysis patient. Her family said that she just had one problem after the other. Dialysis treatments are definitely not a painless experience. While receiving dialysis, patients can experience a myriad of side effects. These include anemia, muscle cramps, low blood pressure, and an itching sensation. It can be very painful as standard. So was Thelma's family overreacting? Although Thelma was experiencing these so-called normal symptoms, she had frequent visits to the emergency room. There she reported extreme pain in her limbs, more than the usual cramping that a patient can experience. During these visits, the doctors would tell Thelma and her family that she must have received too much heparin during her treatment. This was known to be something that can happen sometimes, but not as often as it happened to Thelma. Heparin is a blood thinner that is an essential part of the dialysis process, being injected with a syringe into the IV lines of the dialysis patients. Thelma would continuously have episodes of extreme pain and discomfort, so much so that at one point she woke up without being able to move or talk. This time something was happening that was definitely not normal. Dialysis patients should never experience paralysis as a result of their treatment. This time when she visited the emergency room for her loss of feeling in her limbs, the doctors said that she had received so much heparin that it had permeated her spinal fluid. This essentially partially paralysed her. Thelma's family thought that this had to be medical malpractice, but they were wary of accusing anyone of administering too much heparin to her repeatedly. After all, Thelma's daughter-in-law was a registered nurse. She, for one, didn't want to believe that a fellow nurse could be so negligent. When they tried to find another healthcare provider for Thelma, she simply didn't want to leave. She loved the community that she had at DeVita so much. It was impossible for her to see that anyone could be lacking in the medical capacity to help her. The family, trying not to fight with Thelma, contacted the DeVita Centre. They wanted answers. Their calls, however, went unanswered, left in the dark on what could be happening to their beloved mother and grandmother. And once Thelma's family heard of a recall on heparin, they all relaxed. The faulty heparin must have been the cause of the episodes that Thelma was experiencing. They were glad that they didn't have to cause a nurse to lose her job over these incidents. But on April the 1st, Thelma was experiencing something different than she normally did at the centre. As she was receiving her treatments, she initially felt the normal side effects that anyone would feel when receiving dialysis. But after a while, she told the nurse that was assigned to her that she felt funny. Following her statement, she immediately went into cardiac arrest. Her heart had stopped beating and the nurses swiftly intervened. While one called 911, the others attempted to give her CPR, hoping to restart her heart. She was rushed to the emergency room where they hoped that the doctors would be able to save her life. But before Thelma's family could get to the hospital, she had sadly passed away. As they processed the sudden and devastating loss of Thelma, they grew angry that the DeVita Centre didn't call them sooner. Maybe they could have gotten there in time. Maybe they could have been able to say goodbye. They wanted to get all the information they could about what had happened. They needed answers. The family had spoken with hospital personnel about the events surrounding her arrival at the emergency room. They detailed how Thelma had experienced heart complications as a result of her dialysis treatments. But the staff were slightly unsettled that Thelma was the third patient that had arrived from DeVita that day. All of these patients had experienced the same symptoms. To their surprise, Thelma's good friend Clara Strange had arrived at the hospital 30 minutes earlier. As the family took in this information, they tried to process what it meant for their own mother. They inquired about Clara, knowing that Thelma was good friends with her. Shocking the family even more, Clara had also passed away, again from cardiac arrest. It all seemed almost too coincidental, and the news of the parallels between Clara and Thelma left a strange feeling in the stomachs of Thelma's family. Even though it was a strange occurrence, everyone needed to grieve, and grieve without thinking about looking into the situation further. The DeVita Dialysis Centre's mission is to build the greatest healthcare community the world has ever seen. DeVita offers treatment plans that meet all stages of kidney disease, with their main services being dialysis treatments. Patients are hooked up to machines through IVs for hours of the day, while the dialysis machine removes blood from their body, filters it and returns it back into the bloodstream, a process that the kidneys alone can no longer perform. Because of the prolonged, painful and repeated experience that the patients have to endure, the nurses have a very important job in these centres. These nurses, at the very minimum, provide healthcare, but are considered even more skilled when they are able to make the countless hours more enjoyable by telling jokes, reading them stories, or simply sitting and talking with them. Patients have commented on their experience at DeVita, saying that they truly felt like family whilst being there, quoting feeling valued and like a whole person and not just a patient. Although DeVita has many locations, the centre of the shocking, unimaginable occurrences that took place is their location in Lufkin, Texas. Lufkin is a scenic beauty of its state, with many qualities to offer. People that live there say that although it is a larger community, it is close-knit. If you go to the grocery store, it's likely you'll see someone that you know. No one expected such a tragedy to occur in their tranquil community. It was a normal day of work at the DeVita Center on April 1st, 2008. Patients were receiving their treatments, talking with nurses, and making the most of the otherwise painful day. As the centre began to recover from the tragedy of two beautiful souls being lost, they tried to continue business as usual. Garlin Kelly Jr. was another favourite in the DeVita clinic. Sharon Dearman, a nurse at the centre, stated that he was a joy to be around, adding he was one of her favourite patients to hang out with. She enjoyed it when she saw him come into the centre. Outside of providing his medical care, he talked with her, laughed with her, and shared stories that would make her smile. Another patient of DeVita, Carolyn Reisinger, said that Garlin was a really sweet man. Garlin was a light and beacon of happiness that radiated throughout the facility, positively affecting everyone that he came into contact with. On April the 16th, Garlin was at the centre for his routine round of dialysis care. After Sharon ensured that Garlin was comfortable and that everything was running smoothly, she took a short break. On her break, she heard a sound that had become entirely too familiar at DeVita, the dialyzer alarm. The alarm on the dialysis machine sounds whenever there is something wrong with the lines that transport the fluids, or if there is no blood flowing back into the patient from the machine. As she rushed back into the room, her beloved patient Garlin was suffering a cardiac episode. Sharon heard him utter the words, "What did you give me?" Sharon looked at the lines to try and figure out what had caused this reaction, when she noticed a large, black, stringy ball in his dialysis line, saying that she thought it was a hairball. The incidence of Garlin's cardiac episode was happening over a matter of seconds. Sharon didn't have time to think of what she saw and why she was seeing it, or how to react. He was immediately transported to the hospital, and although he was resuscitated, his body and brain had endured too much to survive. Unlike with Thelma, Garlin's family was able to visit before his passing, although sadly by this stage he could not speak to them. If he could, this whole thing may have been over much sooner. Garlin Kelly would never regain consciousness after that day and would pass in August of 2008. Nurse Sharon Dearman was greatly affected by Garlin's passing, expressing that she experienced a great sadness for a long time after his loss. She had to carry on and be the nurse that her other patients needed her to be. The occurrences of cardiac arrest was cause for serious concern. Only 1 in 180,000 patients experience heart problems as a result of dialysis treatments. The DeVita Dialysis Center had experienced 3 deaths in a matter of just 2 weeks. There were also other patients experiencing unusual complications. They knew that something was wrong. DeVita couldn't explain the amount of patients that were having extremely adverse reactions to their treatments. They decided to launch an internal investigation. They began to collect all the heparin, dialysis lines and water that was used during the treatment cycles. They tested the water, ensured that the heparin was being administered correctly, and tested the dialysis lines for contaminants. But they found nothing. The only physical evidence that was strange was that some nurses reported their machines behaving strangely at times. They made weird noises or demonstrated small mechanical or electrical hiccups, but this was nothing that would cause this kind of distress to patients. Feeling confident in their own investigation, they cautiously kept their doors open. Patient Cora Bryant had no idea that a seemingly routine day at the clinic would end so tragically. She arrived for her usual dialysis treatment on April the 22nd, but she experienced complications from the very beginning. Initially, she was experiencing blood clotting. This alone is not a completely abnormal thing to happen during a round of dialysis, and it can be easily corrected. This is a necessity of heparin. Cora's lines were replaced by her nurse, Martha Mann, and her treatment continued. When Martha went on break, the beeping of the dialysis machine alarm sounded. She hurried back into the room and saw that Cora was stable, watching TV and trying to relax. Martha breathed a sigh of relief as her associate, Candice Lackey, said that the reason for the alarm was because another nurse was resetting Cora's dialysis machine. However, when Nurse Lackey returned, the fluid from the machine was pushed back into Cora's body. She immediately went into cardiac arrest. She never regained consciousness and passed away in July of 2008. It seemed that DeVita was experiencing a particularly unusual bout of bad luck with patients. That was the only explanation that they could think of, anyway. They had tested everything that they could possibly test, sure that there was nothing they could be doing that was causing this to happen. Although it wasn't terribly common for them to experience cardiac arrests, it did happen, and maybe this was just a spike in the statistics. Others began to take notice of the seemingly disproportionate tragedies that were occurring in their loving medical community. People thought that there was no possible way that this could be a coincidence, but what could they do? Opal Few was a 91-year-old woman with a young heart. She told the nurses that they were beautiful every day that she walked into the DeVita clinic, and the nurses said that she was the sweetest pea. The nurses were rooting for her, and it seemed like she was greatly improving until the day of April the 26th. Just like the previous times, her nurses went on a break. Then the alarm sounded, and Opal's life ended almost immediately. The nurses took her passing very hard. They would miss the positive energy she brought to the clinic, but they worked hard to provide the best care possible despite their grieving of Opal. Just 2 days later, the mystery of the numerous complications would begin to be revealed. On April the 28th, Lurleen Hamilton and Linda Hall were sitting next to each other whilst receiving their dialysis treatments. They talked, laughed and reminisced about their earlier days before they spent their time sitting at DeVita. It was then that Lurleen saw a nurse enter the room with a bucket that the employees normally filled with a mixture of water and bleach to disinfect the patient areas. She didn't think anything of it. The nurse was likely getting ready to clean an area that a patient had just left. However, Hamilton was shocked when she watched the nurse pull a syringe out of her pocket. She dipped it into the bucket, filled it with liquid, and then put it back into her jacket. She then walked over to a patient, took the syringe out of her jacket, and injected its contents into the IV line. She then disposed of the syringe into the sharps bin. Sharps bins are medical disposal bins that are commonly used in hospitals and other medical facilities. Physicians, nurses and healthcare workers dispose of syringes, empty IV bags or used vials. The waste is then later normally incinerated. The patient that the nurse injected was Marva Roan. She would almost immediately experience a severe drop in blood pressure. As she continued to watch the nurse in horror, patient Linda Hall watched the same nurse perform the same act, this time on patient Carolyn Reisinger. Reisinger also experienced an extreme drop in blood pressure, recording yet another incident of complications for the clinic. Both patients, Hall and Hamilton, were left in complete disbelief. They knew they couldn't leave it unreported. Although Hall was fearful of what the nurse would do if they told about what they saw, Hamilton had no hesitation. They both told another employee about what they had seen that day. The nurse that the two identified as committing the horrifying acts was Kimberly Sines. When the DeVita administration heard about what happened, they didn't want to overreact. So, perhaps surprisingly, the police weren't called. They swiftly collected the two sharps bins where Kimberly had allegedly disposed of the syringes, testing them for the presence of bleach. When the test came back positive, they knew they needed outside help. Kimberly was immediately sent home, and the doors to the clinic were closed so the police could investigate. When the police first became involved, they were investigating malpractice. This means that they thought one of the nurses were negligent, resulting in the distress of patients. They did not think what had happened was deliberate. Despite this notion, they processed the clinic as if it were a crime scene. They collected collected anything they thought they would need for their investigation, including all of the sharps bins and used IV lines from the month of April. To the extreme aid of the police, the administrators of DeVita had saved all the IV lines of the patients who had suffered cardiac distress during their treatments. And even better, the IV line of Garland Kelly had a syringe still attached to it. The Lufkin police were so efficient in their investigation that they knew that they were underprepared for this type of analysis. They partnered up with the CDC's epidemiology team. This is a branch that deals with the presence of disease or other things that can affect someone's health. With the team put together, they began combing through the medical charts from the month of April. They tested everything that they had collected. Everything that Kimberly had used, every tube and syringe of the 5 patients that had passed away, tested positive for bleach. They also examined the charts of those who had experienced extreme distress or passed away, looking for anything out of the ordinary. During this search, they had found correlative evidence that was too obvious to ignore. Kimberly Signs was listed as a technician on every single chart that attended in pain and suffering. They now knew that they had to talk to Kimberly. Kimberly's interview was strange, to say the least. The point of the interview was not necessarily to get her to confess, but more so to gain as much insight as possible into what happened during each incident. The truth was, they didn't have a ton of information about what had happened besides the 2 witnesses who saw her, and that wasn't nearly enough. They tried to have a completely non-accusatory attitude, making it clear that they were only talking to her to gain information on the events. However, very early on in the interview, Kimberly brought up how she had been accused of hurting patients, and that she was extremely upset about it.
What hurts me the most is for 2 patients to accuse me of giving another patient's medication that was not ordered.
The police were taken aback. They had not even referenced the fact that she could be involved in the harm of the DeVita patients. Rookie error on Kimberly's part. So the interviewers gave her the space to tell her side of the story. Kimberly said that she did in fact inject a fluid into the IV lines of those patients, but it wasn't bleach. Saline is commonly used as a temporary treatment for cramping. Cramping is a side effect of the dialysis cycle. In response to this, the investigators asked Kimberly what she thought happened to those patients, and her explanation was a cause for concern. According to Kimberly, she believed that the reason these patients went into cardiac arrest was because of the presence of Renalin in the dialysis machines. Renalin is a common sterilizer used in these machines. It circulates throughout the machine to keep the internal mechanics of it clean and sterile. Kimberly said that if the Renalin somehow interferes with the IV lines of the patient, it's like bleach going into their body. The investigators were perplexed by this statement. She had been the one to bring up the presence of bleach, and this made them question whether she knew what was happening to these patients all along. As they continued to question her, the interview became even stranger. She began slurring her words, losing focus, and continuously looking at her phone. While the investigators continued speaking with her, it became abundantly clear that she was under the influence of something. There was no point in speaking with her any longer. Police decided to end the interview as Kimberly became almost incoherent. The fact that she was not able to endure a police interview while sober caused them to question whether she was truly capable of providing quality medical care to anyone. They now knew they had to take a look at Kimberly's past. When researching any previous incidents that Kimberly had, they found plenty to choose from. She had been fired from multiple previous healthcare positions, one of which for allegedly stealing prescription medications and being under the influence at work. As the investigators uncovered more information, it only compelled them to look further. She had a long history of domestic violence, divorce, and substance issues. Kimberly Signs became a very strong candidate for their mistreatment of patients, but now they needed evidence. So far, the only thing they had was her name listed on those charts and her record, along with her own alarming testimony. All of this evidence was correlative, but it could not be used to formally accuse her of anything. That is, until they received an interesting phone call. The Lufkin police received a call from a divorce lawyer who was aware of their investigation. According to the lawyer, Kimberly's husband had called him to inquire about filing for divorce from his wife. The investigators saw an opportunity and they took it. Without wasting any time, they hurried to speak to Kimberly's soon-to-be ex-husband. Again, they wanted to tread carefully, with a mission to gain access to the couple's home or computer. To their delight, Kimberly's husband gave the police permission to examine Kimberly's computer history, and what they found was disturbing. Kimberly had conducted internet searches in the middle of the night with the following keywords: bleach detection and bleach effects on the bloodstream. The police investigators began to realize that this was not a case of malpractice. This was intentional. Kimberly's signs was far more dangerous than they initially thought, but they knew that this case would be very, very tricky to prove. Although they now had Kimberly's search history, it was all still coincidental. They needed cold, hard evidence to put her behind bars for the unthinkable things that she had done, and they needed help to do it. The investigators knew that they needed to scientifically prove that Kimberly's injections had directly caused the passing or physical distress of each patient. They brought nursing textbooks, combing through them to educate themselves as much as possible in the little time that they had. Once they had a general understanding, they went to a hospital to conduct some experiments. They had to figure out how the bleach injections would have affected the patients. So they injected a syringe of bleach into a vial of blood. When they did this, the vial instantly turned black, coagulating into a solid mass, kind of appearing like a hairball. The police realized that this was the exact thing that Sharon Dearman reported seeing in Garland Kelly's IV line during his cardiac arrest. As they researched the cause of this, they found that the introduction of blood was causing the red blood cells to burst, releasing iron and producing the black mass that they were seeing in the vial. They realized that these patients experienced the red blood cells of their entire body bursting at the same time. Even worse, the release of iron into the bloodstream causes a burning sensation. Kimberly had lit a fire inside of these patients' bodies. Although this evidence was extremely important, it was still the same as all the other evidence they had, circumstantial. This evidence would convince someone of if the shoe fits, wear it, but that's not enough for the American legal system. There has to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The only way that they could definitively prove Kimberly's guilt was to prove that the bleach actually entered the bloodstream of Kimberly's patients, causing the reaction that occurred in the hospital vial. But how could they prove it? They needed to test the blood of the patients for the presence of bleach, but such a test didn't exist. After all, why would it? A medical researcher would never think to test the theory of, does injected bleach harm people? It obviously would. Number one, it would be extremely inhumane to research, and number two, what would be the necessity for it? Hope at this time was all but lost. Until that is, the CDC introduced the Lufkin Police Department to someone who could do the impossible. The Bioterrorism Council was established to evaluate the possible methods that other countries could use to induce havoc in America, namely chemical warfare. Coincidentally, the council was conducting research on the possibility and effects of using chlorine gases as a method of warfare. They had just developed the chlorotyrosine test. This tests for an amino acid that is not naturally present in the body, but it is present in chlorine and in bleach. Therefore, they were able to test the blood, proving whether bleach had been introduced or not. When this news broke, the Lufkin police scrambled to put together blood tests of all kinds for the council's experimentation. Overall, they sent 51 samples, some of which were non-dialysis patients, some of which were, and 9 of them were the samples of the victims of Kimberly's signs. When the test was conducted on all 51 samples that were sent, only a small number of them tested positive. How many do you think that was? 9, to be exact. Against all odds, the police had gotten their proof and it was time to bring Kimberly to justice. The general consensus was that Kimberly began with the over-injection of heparin. This would explain the numerous complications that both Clara Strange and Thelma Metcalfe experienced before their passing. The unfortunate truth here is that Clara and Thelma were the guinea pigs in Kimberly's wicked experiments, pawns in her perfection of her sinister craft. She was arrested and charged with ending the lives of 5 people in addition to assaulting 5 others. Thelma's family reported feeling extremely angry about the entire situation, especially since they found out about it through the newspapers and not the police. They had read the gruesome headline of Kimberly's crimes, seeing their mother's name printed as the second of her 10 victims. The trial would prove to be extremely stressful for all parties involved. The police were nervous that they didn't have enough evidence, and the families were trembling at the thought of facing the woman that had destroyed their lives. Thelma's family members reported constantly seeing Kimberly smiling, laughing, and gleefully talking with her team before the trial. Even if she was innocent, why would she be doing this? They were disgusted with Kimberly's extreme lack of remorse or respect for the situation in which she had found herself. Did her defense team have any conscience at all? Sometimes you have to wonder. As the trial began, the team had many methods of defending Kimberly's actions. The first being to tear down the testimonies of Linda Hall and Lurleen Hamilton, who saw her draw bleach into a syringe. Kimberly's defense lawyer talked about how it was customary for the employees at DeVita to mix bleach and water. They did this in order to clean and sanitize the surfaces in the center. Furthermore, it was extremely important that the nurses used a specific ratio of bleach to water. This required them to measure out the amount of bleach to mix, 10 cc's to be exact. Even though it was customary for the nurses to use a measuring cup to measure out the bleach, Kimberly's defense stated that it wasn't a requirement at DeVita to do so, and that it wasn't far-fetched for Kimberly to use a syringe as a measuring tool. The point of this defense was to say that what the witnesses saw was Kimberly simply measuring out the bleach for cleaning purposes, and that she could have thrown it out and used a different syringe to inject saline into the patient's IV lines. The problem with this defense was that the police asked her this question during her initial interview. When they asked her what the procedure was for making the cleaning supply, Kimberly stated that they specifically used a measuring cup to measure out the bleach, not a syringe. If it was normal for her to use a syringe in this manner, she would have said that in her explanation. Furthermore, the witnesses also reported that Kimberly never input any information onto the patient's chart, nor did she enter information into the computer after injecting the fluid into their lines. This is important since nurses are required to record any medication that is administered to a patient on their chart, and Kimberly didn't do this. The prosecution also asked, if not Kimberly, then what happened? When it came time for the defense to explain what they thought had happened, they blamed DeVita. According to them, the cause of death in the patients was likely the lack of filtration in the water that DeVita was using at the facility. This was something that the prosecution never even considered or thought to test during their initial investigation. Although DeVita had tested their water way before the police investigation was launched, it was too far in the past to hold up during the trial. Anxiety set in. They couldn't possibly lose this case over these claims, and they had to think quickly to debunk these claims of dirty water. The prosecution adjusted quickly, ready to kick down this faulty hypothesis. If the problem was the inadequate water filtration, why were there only 10 patients affected out of the hundreds that they helped? Furthermore, has there been a case of cardiac arrest as a result of unfiltered water? Even though they had no expert to support their claims, the prosecution put their faith in the logical reasoning of the jury, knowing that unfiltered water does not cause cardiac arrest. Finally, the defense argued that the prosecution had no proof that the patient's passings were directly caused from the injection of bleach. Although it was present in their blood, they couldn't prove that the bleach caused the patients to end up in the morgue. Defense lawyers produced an expert witness, a medical examiner that had some choice words for the prosecuting team. She stated that if they really wanted to prove Kimberly's guilt, they would have exhumed all the patients who passed away and performed autopsies on them, proving that each passing was a direct direct result of the presence of bleach in their bloodstream. The medical examiner spewed that the prosecuting lawyers didn't do this, that they were trying to avoid the truth and dodge providing concrete proof. Onlookers and those affected by the awful acts of Kimberly grew weary. They thought that there wasn't enough evidence, that Kimberly would walk free. But yet again, the prosecution thought on their feet in response to this expert witness. As a rebuttal, the prosecution provided the death certificates of each victim to the medical examiner, asking her to read what the families chose to do with them in preparation for their burial. As she read the word cremated, it quickly became clear that the investigators and lawyers were not avoiding the truth. It was impossible to conduct an autopsy on a pile of ash. Even though the prosecution was able to dodge everything the defense threw at them, the arguments on both sides were still extremely strong. The 2 days that it took the jury to deliberate were torturous for the prosecution lawyers, police investigators, and families affected. They hoped that they had done enough, that every night studying nursing textbooks, every experiment they conducted, and every expert they talked to was worth it to keep Kimberly from ever hurting another person again. As the guilty verdict was read, a huge sense of relief was cast over the entire room. Justice was near. Even though she received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, it was still hard to swallow the pain that the aftermath brought. Not only did the family struggle to come to terms with the tragedies that had occurred, the other nurses of the centre were shocked at the sinister nature of one of their co-workers. They couldn't fathom that someone would have the desire or capability to do this. But as they looked back, they saw signs that they didn't see before. Kimberly was a technician that was assigned to Opal Few. Kimberly had taken a break to smoke a cigarette when Opal went into cardiac arrest, and when a nurse ran outside to tell her what was happening, Kimberly said that she would come in after she had finished her cigarette. That would have been very alarming, as any good nurse would drop everything upon hearing that a patient had coded. But Kimberly didn't, and now the nurses knew why. As Kimberly and her defense team filed numerous appeals to her sentence over the years, people began to take sides on the entire situation. Some people believed that DeVita was partially to blame for the disasters that had taken place, and others thought that the administrators did everything they could to protect their patients. This was just one rogue evil person. People are quoted as saying that they believe DeVita should have acted faster, and even though they claim to be the best of the best, they failed to take notice of Kimberly's record, where she had been fired from previous healthcare facilities for very serious reasons. Despite the difference of opinions, everyone agreed on one essential question: why? What was the reason behind Kimberly's gruesome acts? Was it a saviour complex that failed? After all, other technicians at the centre saw Kimberly attempt to perform CPR, but they had to intervene when she failed to do it correctly. It was a question that would go unanswered regardless of the countless theories. The families of the victims choose to put these questions to rest, doing their best to move on. They are all doing their best to remember their beloved family members for the lives that they lived and the legacies that they leave. There are few words as horrifying in the English language as "you have cancer." And horrifically, these are words that 50% of us will hear in our lifetime. And at that point, you are pretty much at the mercy of medical professionals. If you are fortunate enough to have a chance of recovery, then you really have to put your trust in the process laid out in front of you. Whatever happens, the road won't be easy. But what if your treatment didn't just have side effects, but it was the thing that would end your journey in the worst possible way? It was the 3rd of June 1985. 61-year-old Katie Yarborough visited the Kennestone Regional Oncology Center in Marietta, Georgia. She was to undergo radiation treatment following a lumpectomy. She was prepped for electron treatment to her clavicle. The machine used for Katie's treatment was the Therac 25. The purpose of the Therac 25 was to deliver highly targeted radiation therapy. It was computer controlled, meaning data was input into it, and then it essentially did its thing. The radiation blasting robot hummed to life, and then Katie felt an intense, searing heat. "You've burned me," she cried, but the technician insisted that that was simply impossible. There were no visible burn marks on her skin, just a warm lingering on the surface. The treatment finished and Katie returned home. But soon, her pain escalated, her shoulder froze into position, and an angry red swelling spread through to her back, her skin peeling away in agony. The investigation revealed she had been exposed to a staggering radiation overdose. It was potentially as high as 20,000 rads. Typical doses for this treatment were normally no higher than 200. As an idea of how serious this actually was, just 1,000 rads can be considered a lethal dose. The patient was extremely lucky to escape this incident with her life. However, she still bears the lifelong impacts of this incident. Part of her chest had to be removed. Her shoulder, along with her arm, remained in an essentially paralyzed state, and Katie now had to live her life in chronic pain. And although her life had been in one way saved, she had also suffered a hugely traumatic and negative experience at the hands of this machine. Nobody involved wanted any of this to have happened. A lawsuit was raised and then settled out of court. At the Ontario Cancer Foundation, Therac 25 had been in operation for 6 months. It was a regular day, July the 26th, 1985. A 40-year-old woman walked in for her 24th treatment for cervical cancer. The patient, who was ready for her treatment, settled down onto the table. The technician, familiar with the routine, initiated the treatment. But within 5 seconds, the machine stopped. An error message flashed. It said, H-tilt. The operator looked at the dosimeter, and it showed that no radiation had been applied. They then pressed the P key to proceed, but the machine halted again, and again, and again. It did this 5 times in total before the treatment was aborted. At this point, a technician was called in to perform a thorough check. However, no issues were found with the machine. The Therac 25 continued to treat 6 more patients that day, all without a hitch. Perhaps this time it was a harmless issue, or maybe user error, but no such luck. 4 days later, the woman returned, and now she was complaining of severe burning and swelling in her lower abdomen. Due to obvious concerns, the woman was hospitalized. Medical professionals suspected a severe radiation overdose. The woman had, in a way, been cooked from the inside. This led to the Therac 25 machine temporarily being taken out of service. However, this action could not undo what was already done. On November 3rd, 1985, the female patient passed away. Her autopsy revealed devastating facts. Even if she had survived her original illness and this medical disaster, she would have needed a hip replacement due to the radiation overdose. An overdose that was estimated to be between 13,000 and 17,000 rad. The incident was reported to the FDA and to the Canadian Radiation Protection Bureau. The manufacturer of the Therac 25, AECL, suspected a fault with the micro switches. However, when they tried to confirm the malfunction, they simply couldn't replicate the issue. So whatever happened was just an anomaly. They went on to modify the software, claiming a 5 order of magnitude increase in safety. But the dark shadow of the Therac 25 had only just begun to spread. Fast forward to December 1985, we are now at the Yakima Valley Memorial Hospital. A female patient developed a strange erythema after her treatment with the Therac 25. An erythema is basically a red patch, probably caused by trauma. The redness is due to increased blood supply and dilation of blood vessels. The hospital reported this incident to AECL. The company then confidently replied that a radiation overdose was pretty much impossible. The letter sent by the AECL in response stated that a Therac 25 overdose was not possible without a machine failure or operator error. Yet, 6 months later, the woman developed chronic ulcers, and worse, tissue necrosis, something that can be caused by radiation. The woman underwent surgery to try and rectify her medical issues. However, only a limited amount could be done. And she did live on, but she was plagued with persistent reminders of her ordeal. East Texas Cancer Center, March 21, 1986. Here, the Therac 25 had treated over 500 patients without incident. But that day, a patient came for his 9th treatment for a tumor situated on his back. The machine operator, known to be experienced and meticulous, accidentally entered an X instead of an E for the treatment type. But she realized her error and corrected it. The machine then displayed the message, "Raise, ready, crisis averted." Or was it? As soon as she hit the B key, the machine stopped with a malfunction 54 error message. The dosimeter showed that a relatively low dose of radiation was delivered. The operator, undeterred by the previous message, pressed P to proceed. Again, the machine stopped with the same error. Inside the treatment room, the patient felt a sharp electric shock, and he began to get up. But as he did, the operator pressed P once more, and another jolt was delivered. This was a shock even more intense than its predecessor. Along with the jolt, a loud crackling was heard. And as you may know from my previous videos, a crackling sound when radiation is involved is probably not a good thing. As a result of this second blast, the radiation felt as if his hand had been torn off. He banged on the door of the room until the operator finally let him out. A physician was called into the room and an intense erythema was seen in the area. The patient was sent home. He was thought to have somehow experienced a minor electric shock. But, as you have probably gathered, this wasn't the case. Sending the man home was a grave mistake. The patient had in fact received a huge dose of radiation. It measured between 16,500 and 25,000 rads. This dose was delivered in just a fraction of a second, and on an area of skin around 1/4 of an inch squared. Treatment of the man continued, but things kept getting worse. He terrifyingly experienced paralysis of the left arm, nausea and vomiting, and he was hospitalized for radiation-induced myelitis of the spinal cord. His legs, mid-diaphragm and vocal cords also ended up being paralyzed. The man survived for 5 agonizing months, before finally his time on this earth came to an end. The cause being a massive radiation overdose. Less than a month later, on April the 11th, 1986, the same operator was back at work. This time, a patient needed treatment for a facial skin cancer. Once more, the Therac 25 monitor showed the malfunction 54 message. The treatment was administered, and again that dreadful sound was heard. The terrifying crackle of radiation out of control. The patient felt a searing, burning sensation, and by this stage, you can probably guess, they received a violent blast of radiation directly into their head. Due to this, the patient ultimately lost their battle on May the 1st of the same year. His autopsy revealed critical radiation-induced damage to the right temporal lobe and brainstem. The medical facility and AECL needed to replicate the error that had occurred. If they could do that, they could stop this from happening to anyone else. It was discovered that rapid data entry could have reproduced the error, but AECL initially couldn't replicate this event. Back at the Yakima Valley Memorial Hospital, now on January the 17th, 1987, another patient was in a treatment room preparing for their therapy. The operator fired a test dose of radiation using film verification. This shows the field affected by the radiation blast. Adjustments were then made to the aperture and it was ready for treatment. But when the operator hit the B key, the machine stopped after 5 seconds. It displayed a fleeting error message. The operator entered the treatment room to make some manual adjustments to the turntable. They then returned to the controls of the Therac 25. Treatment could now finally begin. P was entered onto the device to proceed with the treatment. The patient could be heard through the intercom system. However, their words could not be made out. A dose of radiation was delivered, but once more it was far greater than was prescribed. In fact, it was around 100 times greater. The patient felt a severe burning sensation, and then came the reddening of the skin. Within hours, they developed physical burns. In reality, he had received between 8 and 10,000 rads instead of just 86. This patient survived for around 3 months until his time on this earth came to an end. His family settled out of court. In many tales of tragedy, there is a hero. And in this case, it is a man named Fritz Hager. He was a diligent staff physicist at the East Texas Cancer Center in Tyler, Texas. After the second incident at the facility, Fritz was resolute in his mission to uncover the truth. In both cases that took place at the facility, the Therac 25 displayed the cryptic malfunction 54 message. This error code was strangely not mentioned in the manual. AECL later explained that it meant the computer was essentially confused. It couldn't determine if there was an overdose or underdose of radiation. Now remember, the same radiotherapy technician had been involved in both incidents at the center, so Fritz brought the technician back into the control room. They endeavored to not leave the room until the problem was solved. This could well save lives. With the technician running the machine, after hours of testing and retesting every possible combination of actions, they finally pinpointed the issue. The VT100 console used for entering Therac 25 radiation prescriptions allowed cursor movement via up and down keys. If the user selected X-ray mode, the machine would begin setting up for high-powered X-rays, a process that took around 8 seconds. If the user switched to electron mode within those 8 seconds, the turntable wouldn't switch over correctly, leaving it in an unknown state. All prior testing had been slow and careful, as one would expect. However, due to the nature of this error, that type of testing was totally inadequate. It simply never would have created the combination of actions needed, nor within the time span they needed to occur in. It took someone who worked with the machine daily to find the error. Finally, Fritz could demonstrate how to produce malfunction 54 at will. But even with this smoking gun, the ability to recreate the error, convincing AECL would be more of a challenge. It took numerous phone calls, along with multiple detailed fax reports, before the company could replicate the behavior in their own machine. The code used within the Therac 25 machine was brought under the microscope. Further testing, pushed along by ongoing lawsuits, showed just how serious this issue was. Upon testing, the software was shown to be so inadequate that it could even blow fuses on the Therac 25 under certain conditions. The code was proven to not just be badly written and poorly documented, but to be dangerous to the highest degree. The Therac 25 software was a ticking time bomb, and it had already claimed several victims. But now, at least, it would claim no more. On a quiet February afternoon in 1932, Patricia Maguire lay down for a nap in her Oak Park home, and then she just stayed asleep. Her eyes would flutter open. She could sometimes smile, and on rare days, she followed commands written on a chalkboard. But for 5 years, Patricia remained trapped in a liminal state, conscious but unreachable, breathing but unmoving. Newspapers called her the Sleeping Beauty of Illinois. Her mother kept vigil beside her bed. Nurses combed her dark hair. Doctors were baffled, but then the whispers started. By Christmas of 1934, Patricia Maguire had been asleep for nearly 3 years. But that December, something changed. Her brown eyes, once dull and glassy, finally began to focus once again. She followed her mother's movements around the room. When asked a question, she could sometimes curl a finger in response. To celebrate this, the family redecorated the living room. They brought out the ornaments that hadn't seen daylight since 1931, and in front of the Christmas tree they placed a new chair. It was specially padded and reinforced to support Patricia's now frail frame. It took 2 people to lift her from the bed. Her body, so long unused, had begun to forget how to sit upright. But thanks to her mother's daily massages and tireless care, her muscles hadn't yet fully atrophied. Patricia sat by the fire that Christmas morning, not speaking, not smiling, but the family believed she was now present once more. Photographers came, reporters hovered, and the name Sleeping Beauty stuck. Neighbours speculated about curses or divine punishment. Others whispered about gas leaks or secret government experiments. But one thing was undeniable. Patricia was far from alone in her experience. Across the country and in medical journals worldwide, doctors had started recognising her symptoms: the eerie sleep, the cranial nerve paralysis, the twitches, the deep shifting mental fog. They'd seen it all before. It's just that most had stopped talking about it, that most had hoped it was over. But Patricia Maguire was living proof that the strange sickness had never really gone away, just that it itself had perhaps been sleeping. However, Patricia's story was not the beginning or the end here. Long before her, there was another wave. Between 1915 and the late 1920s, a terrifying illness swept the globe. It started like the flu, a sore throat, a headache, a strange heavy sleep. But for thousands, that sleep never ended. Bodies froze mid-motion, eyes drifted upward in an unblinking crisis. Some patients screamed involuntarily. However, this symptom was so rare that it earned its own name, clazomania, and when that screaming stopped, there would then be silence. Patients were trapped inside their own bodies. They couldn't speak, they couldn't move, but they were still aware. Doctors called it encephalitis lethargica, or inflammation of the brain with drowsiness. By 1924, it had infected over 1 million people worldwide, and roughly 500,000 of those died. Of those who survived, many developed a kind of frozen state. Years later, it would be called post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. Muscles rigid, faces mask-like, minds still intact. For a brief time, the disease was everywhere. To know of it was to live in fear. And then, just as mysteriously, it vanished. Newspapers moved on. Families buried those that they'd lost. Survivors were institutionalized and mainly forgotten. And the medical community on large stopped asking questions. No one could explain what had happened. And perhaps more terrifyingly, no one could say that it wouldn't happen again. In the winter of 1915, war-torn Europe was bracing for hunger, as well as another wave of influenza. But in the hospitals of Vienna, something strange was happening. Patients arrived dazed and trembling. They were speaking nonsense. Some slept for days, barely waking to eat. Others were hyperactive, manic and hallucinating. A few froze in place, statue still, their eyes wide open but seemingly unseeing. Dr. Konstantin von Economo, a neurologist at the University of Vienna, saw something disturbingly familiar in these cases. But at the time, it was nothing that fit just one diagnosis. So he was the one that named this syndrome encephalitis lethargica. Within months, though, the illness was spreading. Paris, London, Berlin, and by 1918 it was leaping continents. New York, Montreal, Mexico City, Delhi. People would go to bed with a sore throat, and well, they never came back. But what made this even more chilling was its unpredictability. In one house, a teenager might collapse in a stupor, whilst their siblings remained perfectly fine. One patient may recover in days, and another could deteriorate for years. Von Economo broke the syndrome into types: somnolent, hyperkinetic, and amyostatic akinetic. Catchy. However, These were all just different faces of the same sleeping demon. The doctor also noticed something else, something terrifying. Even those who recovered often were changed. They grew impulsive, aggressive. Some developed what he called moral insanity. Others lost the ability to feel emotion at all. And the youngest victims, those under 5, often ceased to continue developing normally, even when they were healthy and hitting all milestones previously. So this wasn't just a sleeping sickness, it was something that seems to rewire the brain. By the early 1920s, encephalitis lethargica had become a true pandemic. Tens of thousands of people were now dying, though not all at once. Unlike the influenza that surged and vanished in waves, this disease crept like a fog. It spread slowly and silently. It didn't seem to care about age or health. Young soldiers could collapse in barracks. Children would just fall asleep in classrooms. Mothers could lose the ability to recognize their babies. In some cities, it was common to see people sitting for hours on park benches, unmoving, expressionless, but they were otherwise fully awake. But some sat like this for decades. Medical wards became overflowed. And whereas the death toll was obviously horrifying, equally so was what it left behind. The world now contained thousands of people who were technically alive, but they were locked inside broken bodies. They couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't cry out. They were both there, but not. One woman spent 2 years in a hospital bed, her eyes open the whole time. One day when a nurse asked if she could hear them, the woman blinked once, meaning yes. But whether this should be taken as a positive or a negative is hard to say. Hospitals stopped naming the illness in charts. They called it catatonia, affective disorder, psychiatric collapse. But neurologists knew what they were seeing. They knew its name. They just didn't know what it wanted or how to make it stop. In the decades after the pandemic faded, survivors remained tucked away in hospitals and long-term care homes. Many were completely immobile. But in the 1960s, a young neurologist named Oliver Sacks walked into a ward in the Bronx and saw something extraordinary. The patients there, dozens of them, were still frozen in place. Some had been like that since the 1920s. Sacks believed that he could help them. He began administering a new drug, L-Dopa. This was developed for Parkinson's disease. Within just days, some of the patients began to stir, and then, impossibly, they woke. They spoke, they laughed. One man reportedly stood up and danced, as though decades of silent anguish had melted away overnight. However, this miracle would not be long-lasting. In time, the patients' bodies began to resist the medication. Their movements became erratic, their minds more frayed. Some developed terrifying compulsions or sank into emotional torment. Others returned to their eternal stillness. It was a brief awakening, followed by a second, perhaps even more devastating silence. Sacks later wrote about the experience in his book, Awakenings, calling these patients extinct volcanoes that had erupted back to life, only to be buried once more. The public was stunned by his book, because by this time the world had forgotten encephalitis lethargica, but now it was remembered once more. But just as quickly, the world would look away once again. 100 years have now passed since this disease first stalked hospital corridors and bedroom doorways, and somehow we still don't really know what caused it. At first, doctors blamed the 1918 flu pandemic, but the evidence there never quite lined up. The symptoms were too different. The timelines didn't really match. Others suspected a bacteria or a virus that we've never discovered. In recent years, researchers have found hints, autoimmune markers, damaged hypothalamic neurons, even enterovirus traces in preserved brain tissue. But there's no single definitive answer. Some experts now believe that encephalitis lethargica wasn't one disease at all, but a cluster of similar syndromes. Or maybe it was a one-time mutation, an evolutionary misfire that disappeared before we could understand it. That uncertainty leaves an open door, because if we don't know what caused it, then we don't know if it's truly gone. Patricia Maguire's case came years after the main epidemic, and she was one of the last. But every so often, a doctor somewhere will see a patient with strange sleepiness, with frozen muscles, a dazed expression, and they'll wonder, is it coming back? Has it ever truly left? How would the world deal with it this time around? And well, we may be forced to find out. In the spring of 2019, a healthy 9-year-old girl in Washington state fell asleep on the school bus. Her mother couldn't wake her. Doctors ran every test they could think of. Her scans were clear. There was no infection, no trauma, but she stayed asleep. For months on end, she drifted in and out of consciousness. At times, she could follow a flashlight with her eyes. Other times, she didn't respond at all. Some doctors would call this autoimmune encephalitis. Others whispered a different possibility. They pulled old medical books off the shelves, and they found themselves looking at the face of Patricia Maguire. Other recent cases, small, scattered, have been reported in Europe, South America, and Asia, each with subtle echoes of that old forgotten sickness, unexplained fatigue, muscle rigidity, masked faces. In a world still reeling from COVID, the question of viral triggers is no longer hypothetical, and researchers are once again paying attention. Some labs are investigating whether the immune system might be attacking the brain after certain infections. Others are studying the basal ganglia, the deep brain structures tied to movement, sleep, and emotion. But the truth is, we don't know if we're looking for a disease or just chasing a ghost of a mystery. Patricia Maguire passed in 1937, having never fully returned to herself. She became a symbol of what it means to be almost awake, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying illnesses aren't the ones that kill us, but the ones that leave us waiting, watching, and wondering if sleep is ever truly safe. Newborn babies, the most precious, the most innocent thing on the planet. The very thought of anyone even wishing something ill upon something so beautiful is so abhorrent and so inhuman that it's almost unfathomable. But sadly, some dark souls out there won't just have these thoughts. They will bring them into reality. They will take action and do the unthinkable. This is the full and detailed case of Lucy Letby. Our story begins in the heart of Cheshire, England. There, the Countess of Chester Hospital has stood for centuries. From humble beginnings as a dispensary for the needy in the 1800s, it has grown into a vital institution offering a wide range of medical services. At the core of the hospital's mission is a commitment to serving the community. From maternity care to specialised units in cardiology, oncology, and more. The hospital also stands as a hub for medical research and education, fostering collaboration with universities as well as medical schools. More specifically to this story, the neonatal unit is a sanctuary for the tiniest of patients, where the delicate cries of newborns can be heard throughout each day. It is a place of both vulnerability and resilience. A place where the dedication of healthcare professionals provide the best care possible. Chester in Cheshire, England is a city that is infested with history and charm. It can be dated back to the Roman times. It is the city where many excited families give birth to beautiful newborn children, but the pictures painted here aren't always beautiful. In Nursery 1, often referred to as the Hot Room, the Countess of Chester Hospital's dedicated staff faced many challenging circumstances. In November of 2013, Victoria and Michael Whitfield welcomed their precious daughter Felicity into the world at just 34 weeks. In those early days, the Whitfields placed their trust in the caring hands of Lucy Letby, a nurse that had recently begun working on the unit. Lucy was described as a sweet, innocent nurse, one that the Whitfields were happy to have taking care of their newborn bundle of joy. On November the 20th, Lucy sat beside baby Felicity, and then the peaceful atmosphere was shattered. The sound of alarms pierced the air, and Lucy sprang into action. She pressed the emergency button to call for reinforcements, doing what she could to restore the baby's health. As the medical team rushed into the room, they worked tirelessly to save Felicity's life with intense focus, a life which had suddenly taken a dark turn. Felicity's lungs had collapsed. She was holding on to life by a single thread. The medical team was able to fully intubate and stabilize the new baby, but questions still remained about what exactly had caused such a drastic change. This would be the first of many suspicious occurrences at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The next 2 years would remain relatively quiet in the neonatal unit, at least as far as unexplained complications were concerned. However, on June 8, 2015, that all would change. Baby A, one of a pair of twins, began displaying signs of distress, an all too common occurrence in a place where newborn babies are closely monitored. While baby A's mother was concerned about the distress, the nurse in charge had told her not to worry as she monitored his progress. But within 26 minutes, that same nurse recognized the gravity of the situation. They urgently called for a doctor to intervene. The baby's stats were tanking and it wasn't looking good. Among the chaos, the baby's mother anxiously awaited for news on her child's fate, watching as doctors crowded around her baby. The nurse tried to reassure the mother in a calming manner, offering words of comfort in the most difficult of moments. However, the situation took a somber turn as the urgency escalated. Before the clock struck 9 on that night, baby A's struggle came to a heartbreaking end, leaving medical professionals to grapple with an unexplained loss. In the aftermath, the nurse extended a gentle gesture to the grieving parents, offering to bathe and dress the baby, giving them intimate time with him before he was taken to the mortuary. In the wake of baby A's tragic loss, the entire neonatal unit endured intense emotional strain, and just 28 hours later, the unthinkable happened. Baby B, baby A's twin sister, suddenly collapsed. A sense of urgency filled the air once more as another emergency situation unfolded. In those tense moments, baby B was successfully resuscitated, saved from the same fate as her twin brother. While relief washed over the team and the parents, questions still swirled as to what exactly had gone wrong. They performed testing to try and discern exactly what had happened, finding that baby B had loops of gas-filled bowels, indicating that a bowel obstruction had caused the collapse. This was not a cause for immediate concern. Baby B was monitored closely as she eventually gained health, and she was eventually discharged with her still grieving parents. On June 14, 2015, baby C made its entrance into the world. He was born 10 weeks before his due date. His arrival was met with cautious optimism, requiring no immediate medical attention and seemingly in good health. Despite this good news, the fact that he was premature landed him in the neonatal unit. The staff in this unit closely monitored baby C's progress, and all seemed well until another grim turn took place. In the midst of the challenge to save his life, a nurse's hushed words to baby C's mother carried the weight of the world. She said, "He's going." Despite everyone's efforts, baby C's condition just couldn't be repaired. He passed away within a day of his birth, leaving another unexplained crisis on the books. Baby D was brought into the world 6 days later as a full-term infant. However, she found herself in a neonatal unit since the mother's water had broken early. Medical professionals had given her a clean bill of health but kept her in for observation. However, as the early hours of her life unfolded, baby D endured a series of unexplained crises. Throughout the course of 2 horrifying hours, baby D coded time and time again. Nurses noted that she had skin discoloration each time they had to rush to her aid. Baby D would suffer yet another collapse just 34 minutes later. This sadly ended her life before it could even truly begin. Now, after 4 unexplained emergency situations in just 1 month, the head of the neonatal department, Dr. Breary, took notice of the strange occurrences. He conducted a meticulous review of baby D's case, as well as the 3 previous unexplained incidents. However, no definitive conclusions arose from the investigation, leaving only further questions about what was happening at the hospital. Babies E and F were born 10 weeks premature. They resided in a neonatal unit under the care of a medical team. On August 3, 2015, their mother visited the unit, milk bottles in hand, but her discovery left her concerned. She noticed that baby E had a red liquid around his mouth. She called out to the nurse nearby to check on him. The nurse quickly calmed her nerves, saying it was simply a result of tube irritation in baby E's stomach. The twins' mother was calmed, but tensions only grew as a doctor visited on his rounds the next morning. Upon inspection of baby E, the doctor had noticed the same thing. They found fresh red fluid coming up baby E's tube. From outside the unit, baby E's mother heard the familiar sound of her own child's horrendous crying. She rushed to find her baby in distress as resuscitation attempts were being made. But despite their best efforts, baby E was the 4th baby that had lost his life suddenly and without reason. Less than 24 hours later, baby F crashed as well, leaving the hopeless mother in a state of utter despair. Luckily, though, baby F was able to be restored to full health, but this left behind another suspicion that could no longer be ignored. It was at this point that nurses became suspicious of these occurrences. Further testing showed abnormal levels of insulin in baby F's system. This could not be explained away easily. The nurses began to suspect that someone had overdosed the infant with insulin. This must have caused a myriad of complications from the extreme levels. By October, 3 more infants had passed away unexpectedly. Something had to be done. Nurses, doctors, and even Dr. Berry went to their supervisors and consultants to beg for some kind of investigation from upper management, but their cries were muffled by words that claimed they were making a fuss. Even though some kind of investigation was promised, it wouldn't take place until February of 2016. Dr. Berry had waited too long. He knew he had to take action. After ordering a thematic review to the now extremely high toll of lost lives, he found one common factor that existed among every single unexplained occurrence. One nurse that had been on staff during every single collapse. This nurse's connection to mortalities and scares were met with confirmation from doctors and nurses that were uncomfortable with working with her. Suspicion within the unit had already been growing about her behaviour. Dr. Berry called a meeting to discuss his findings. The findings were sent to the medical director of the hospital, Ian Harvey. Dr. Berry begged for an emergency meeting to take action, but no such meeting would occur for 3 more months. During this 3-month period, 2 more babies experienced life-threatening circumstances that could not otherwise be explained. They were found with either air or extreme amounts of insulin within their system. This couldn't be an accident. These actions were clearly intentional. Other nurses and doctors were refusing to work with this one nurse, the nurse that was becoming increasingly more suspicious. Taking action to the best of their ability, the nurse of interest was no longer allowed to work on night shifts. She was banned until the confusion was settled. On May the 11th, Dr. Berry would finally get his urgent meeting with Harvey and Alison Kelly, Kelly being the director of nursing. It was during this meeting that Berry would spout his complaints, his concerns and alarms about the nurse who everyone was now afraid of, with seemingly nothing being done to stop the huge spike in child mortality rates. However, the only response that was received was an assurance letter from the NHS Trust. This is the organisational unit in charge of that hospital. According to this letter, there was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that a nurse was causing this huge mortality rate. They put it down to purely coincidence. With nowhere to turn, doctors and nurses in the neonatal unit were forced to return to work, knowing that every day would be riddled with anxiety over the next child's collapse. By June of 2016, directly after another strange crisis, the nurse in question had taken a vacation to Ibiza. Everyone was now able to settle and breathe, at least for a little while. During this 2-week vacation, no emergent situations occurred within the neonatal unit, but on June the 23rd, the nurse had returned. This was just in time for another life on the neonatal unit to end. Child O was a perfectly healthy baby. He was due to be discharged to his parents. As had always occurred, he collapsed unexpectedly, leaving shocked and distraught parents behind. 13 minutes later, Baby O's triplet brother met the exact same fate. This was the final straw. It had to end here. Too many lives had been lost. Doctors and nurses were tired of standing by and doing nothing, of receiving no help from above. Upon investigation, it was found that Baby O had an injury to his liver. Air had been injected into his bloodstream. This, once more, was no accident. Someone had deliberately done this to this poor, innocent soul. Dr. Brery urgently called Karen Reese. She was the duty executive of the hospital, telling her what had just happened and demanding that the vicious nurse be removed from the unit. Reese, instead of finally launching an investigation, simply said that the nurse was safe to work, and that she herself would take the responsibility for any further situations. Dr. Brery was met with more disappointment, knowing that this wouldn't be the end. He decided to remove the nurse from the unit anyway, placing her on clerical duties in the wake of inaction. Again, the mortality rate had slowed and the strange collapses ceased. 3 months of peace would preside over the neonatal unit until in September of 2016, the hospital would receive a letter of grievance from Lucy Letby, the nurse that had formerly worked on the neonatal unit, before suddenly being forced to work in a clerical position. The letter detailed the unprofessional behaviour and attitude that she had received from other doctors and nurses on staff, saying that she was constantly bullied for months. In response to this letter, all doctors and nurses were forced to write a letter of apology to Lucy. After writing the letter of apology, another cry for an investigation rang out towards the NHS Trust. An investigation that did happen and took 2 months to complete. The Trust found in November of 2016 that nothing out of the ordinary was occurring in the neonatal unit. Every path had been exhausted and there was nowhere left to turn. Maybe they had just been wrong. Maybe Lucy Letby was just the sweet, fun-loving and bubbly nurse that everyone else said that she was. If that was the case, what else could have been causing such crushing chaos? Nurses and doctors combed through every option they could think of. Viruses, contaminations, anything they could grab onto to explain the horror that had been happening. They tried as hard as they could to come up with an alternative explanation. But no such explanation could be found. It had to be harm inflicted at the hands of a nurse. and that nurse had to be Lucy Letby. A year would pass until in May of 2017, police were finally called in to investigate the carnage in the neonatal unit at the hospital after the staggering mortality rates were finally seen on paper. After considering the option of naturally occurring reasons, it was more likely that the lost lives were the result of deliberate harm. And it didn't take long for police to point to a prime suspect. With just the coincidence of her shifts alone, Lucy Letby was arrested.
Hello, Lucy, is it?
Yes.
Hello, my name's Chester, please. Locate Stefan, 2 seconds.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Is there anybody else? Yeah, not a problem.
I'm going to put you in the back seat over here.
Hold on, man.
Yes. Okay, just take a seat in there for me, Lucy. I'll move that seat forward a bit shortly.
Yeah, I've just had knee surgery. So
Oh, right, okay.
Her initial interview would yield nothing. Lucy insisted that everything that happened was out of her control. She said that the whole neonatal team wondered together what may be occurring.
They told me that there had been a lot more deaths and that I'd been linked to somebody that was there for a lot of them.
Did you have any concerns that there was a rise in the mortality rate?
Yes.
Okay, so tell me about that. What concerns did you have?
I think we'd all just noticed as a team in general, the nursing staff, that this was a rise compared to previous years.
However, this did not deter investigators. This only prompted them to investigate for physical evidence instead of a confession. Searches of Lucy's home as well as her parents' home provided the staggering evidence that they needed. Lucy had strangely been hoarding patient records. This was along with multiple handwritten notes about her thoughts and experiences. Among these notes were the words, "I am evil. I did this." In Lucy's bedroom, over 200 handover sheets were discovered in shopping bags. Sheets which detailed the depressing ends and emergent situations of the babies in the neonatal unit. Police continued to search, turning next to Lucy's computer. Investigation into her search history found that Lucy had searched for 11 of the affected families on Facebook. Additionally, searches on her smartphone discovered a photo of a sympathy card, one that was sent to one of the families. The card was signed with Lucy's name. The police would spend the next year combing through the thousands of pages of reports and interviews, finally gathering enough evidence to charge Lucy Letby with her heinous crimes. In November of 2020, all the evidence pointed to one fact: Lucy Letby was responsible for ending these infants' lives. A supporting role of this evidence included the text messages that Lucy would send in correlation with each lost life. She would bask in the sympathy she received as the unsuccessful hero in these infant lives. She would say things like, "It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Hard coming in tonight and seeing the parents." She would continue to garner the sympathy of her friends over each chaotic emergency, detailing each loss and complication. It was clear that Lucy had no remorse for what she had done. Years after these numerous incidents, families were forced to grapple with the fact that they did not lose their children due to natural circumstances, and that nothing had been done to stop it happening again. As news broke that these infants had passed away at the hands of a nurse, the powers in Westminster released a statement saying they would be launching an independent inquiry to investigate the inaction of the NHS Trust. Families look back on her interactions with Lucy, with one mother realising that she had witnessed one of Lucy Letby's attacks. Despite not being his designated nurse, Baby C's mother had seen Lucy standing over her son's monitor. This was just moments before the emergency alarm sounded. Lucy Letby had been injecting that baby with air. And she had been injecting air and insulin into the IV bags and the intubation tubes of every single baby, leading them all to either extreme health complications or to the end of their lives. Additionally, it was found that Lucy had injected some of the infants multiple times after their lives didn't end, with parents discovering the true horrors that the children had gone through at her hands. All of this and more would be revealed at her trial in October of 2022. There, every detail of her crimes would be aired out by witness statements. Lucy faced the weight of 22 charges. She pled not guilty to each and every one. The most compelling evidence that the prosecution would produce was the handwritten notes found inside of Lucy's home. The notes containing the troubling confessions of her evil nature and the fact that she did it was difficult for the defense to combat. However, what was also present were notes declaring her innocence, leaving the question of her guilt extremely unclear. What proved to be truly haunting were the witness statements. Expert witness Dr. Dewey Evans took the stand, testifying to the harrowing instance involving child G. He revealed that under Lucy's care, the baby had received far more milk than prescribed, one that couldn't be anything other than a deliberate act, one with intent to harm. As the courtroom drama continued, another startling statement came to light from Lisa Walker, a co-worker of Lucy's. According to her testimony, not only had Lucy Letby neglected to help when one of the infants was in distress, but had also chastised another worker for lending a hand. Lucy's squeaky clean, nice Lucy facade was beginning to crumble. As witness testimonies continued, Lucy's supervisor detailed the odd behaviour that she exhibited during her time on the unit. She would spend excessive time with babies that were not assigned to her care, with doctors witnessing her watch the oxygen levels drop and do nothing. Co-workers detailed how Lucy would neglect her own assigned infants in order to latch onto other infants in the unit, other infants which would later have health complications. As the trial progressed, the jury was shown Lucy's diary, in which she had written the initials of each of the babies who had passed away or that had experienced serious emergencies. The amount of time that officers spent gathering the evidence proved to be useful as Lucy's act was being destroyed. May of 2023 would mark a pivotal moment in the trial as Lucy took the stand in her own defense. With a voice full of emotion, she made the declaration that she had only ever done her best to care for the infants, saying that she was there to take care of them, not to harm them. As her questioning continued, Lucy introduced an unexpected claim. She said that the tragic occurrences were the result of plumbing issues within the hospital, and that nurses were neglecting to wash their hands. This was something that the prosecution hadn't prepared for. They scrambled to continue their fight to prove Lucy's guilt. Nick Johnson, lead prosecutor, had succinctly summarised what the jury was meant to do. It was their duty to weigh the evidence presented, deciding whether Lucy was truly guilty of her crimes, of injecting air and insulin over 22 times into various infants, ones that otherwise would have had the very real promise of life. As the jury deliberated for 22 days to match her 22 charges, the legal teams of both sides considered what the outcome may be. While Lucy did have an overwhelming evidence against her, some of the 22 charges included multiple attempts against the same baby, but attempts that ultimately resulted in their survival. Would the entire trial be thrown out over any of these charges? Ultimately, Lucy Letby was found guilty of 14 of the 22 charges. She was found guilty of ending the lives of 7 infants and attempting to end the life of 7 more. Lucy refused to leave her prison cell for the sentencing hearing, apparently unable to bear the shame of the families of which she had destroyed. It was during this hearing in August of 2023 that the judge would equate Lucy's acts to sadism.
This was a cruel, calculated and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children, knowing that your actions were causing significant physical suffering and would cause untold mental suffering. You created situations so that collapses or causes of collapses would not be obvious or associated with you. You removed and retained confidential records of events relating to your crimes and checked up on bereaved parents. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions. During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. In their totality, the offences of murder and attempted murder were of exceptionally high seriousness, and just punishment, according to law, requires a whole life order. Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.
Lucy became the 4th woman in English history to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lucy is currently working to appeal this sentence, hoping to see the outside world once more. On the other side of justice, Nick Johnson announced that his team would be retrying Lucy on just one of the accusations, one story involving a baby girl in February of 2016, a trial that will not take place until June of 2024. Nick Johnson will not be able to retry this case until after Lucy appeals the original conviction. In the meantime, the attention of many is turning to the NHS Trust, the organisation in charge of the hospital. Healthcare workers who had worked alongside Lucy have come forward to shed light on a troubling workplace environment. They have recounted experiences of a hostile atmosphere for those who had tried to raise concerns about Lucy and her crimes early on, and the pervasive fear of a destroyed reputation that swept it under the rug. Throughout Lucy's trial, several paediatricians who worked alongside her had repeatedly voiced their concerns about her behaviour, only being met with resistance on the part of management. Dr. John Gibbs, a member of the department, disclosed that paediatricians were definitely concerned that Lucy had been harming neonatal patients, but responses to these concerns would take months upon months to arrive. Many of the families, staff and public firmly believe that if the hospital's management had taken appropriate action, that many lives could have been saved. Dr. Jayaram, a doctor that had raised concerns about Lucy Letby in October of 2015, stating that the truth needs to come out about why no action was taken to protect the innocent lives within the hospital. Additionally, the delayed involvement of the police is an even more concerning factor, highlighting a systemic issue within the NHS. Issues that could perhaps stem from the systemic underfunding of the NHS, the overworking of NHS caregivers, of unfathomable bureaucracy, of needless middle management, and the funneling of taxpayer money away from actual healthcare and into private entities and donors' pockets. Altogether, this contributes to a lower level of care, arguably by design. Dewey Evans, the expert witness for the prosecution, among many others, strongly believes that there should be a police investigation into the hospital executives who consistently ignored the claims against Lucy. Lawyer Tamlin Bolton is representing the families of several babies who were the victims of Lucy Letby, making civil claims against the trust in charge of the hospital. Bolton emphasised that the importance of scrutinising what the trust knew about the situation must must be uncovered for proper justice to be served, highlighting the compliance they hold in the tragedies that occurred. While the British government did launch an independent inquiry into the trust, many representatives of the victims' families have argued that this isn't enough. Letters have been sent to the revolving door of health secretaries, demanding the government to establish a statutory inquiry, an inquiry which would compel individuals involved to provide evidence, as opposed to the independent inquiry which allows for them to opt out of providing evidence. Rob Behrens, the man who is leading the fight against the trust, has stressed that this moment is pivotal in the history of the health service, underscoring the need to understand why patient safety isn't given as much importance as the reputation of the management teams. The call for a more comprehensive investigation and the protection of those who raise concerns is a significant step towards addressing systemic issues in the healthcare system and in gaining true justice for the families involved that endure such heartache. In late 2024, strange reports began surfacing in Thailand. Women were disappearing, young, healthy, and all with one thing in common. They'd left the country for work, promised lucrative jobs overseas, but once they arrived, they vanished. Their families received brief, cryptic messages, "I'm fine, don't worry," and then nothing. Calls went unanswered. Social media accounts went silent. It was as if these women had never existed. At first, the disappearances seemed random, but investigators started noticing a pattern. Almost every missing woman had last been seen in the same place, Georgia. Authorities began looking into the case, but without concrete leads, there was little they could do. The women were adults. They had willingly travelled abroad. There were no signs of immediate danger and no evidence of a crime. But then, everything changed. One woman escaped. She arrived at a police station in Georgia begging for help, and when officers asked her where she had come from, she told them something that made their blood run cold. There are more women. They won't let them leave. They take our eggs. Over and over again. The woman's story was almost too terrifying to believe, something taken directly from a horror movie. She had come to Georgia expecting work as a surrogate mother, an opportunity to help families, while earning enough money to support her own. The woman had seen an advert for a job on Facebook, one that would pay between 400,000 and 600,000 baht, which is around $11,000 to $17,000. The woman from Thailand didn't have a passport, but that was no problem because the passport along with travel expenses were paid for by the company. The woman was expecting to go and live with a grateful and nurturing couple, people that wanted a baby more than anything else in the world. August came around and it was now time for the job to begin. She and around 10 other prospective surrogates were led on their trip to Georgia by another Thai woman, a woman who they expected was their guide and almost their friend. Upon their arrival though, things quickly fell apart. The dream they were sold was now a nightmare. The moment the woman arrived, something felt very, very wrong. The facility wasn't what the woman expected. It wasn't a loving home of waiting parents-to-be. It wasn't even a hospital. The building was secluded, hidden away, difficult to find. The windows were covered, the doors were locked, and a group of around a dozen women would quickly discover they weren't there alone either. 100 other women were already inside. They were mainly Thai, Vietnamese, and Cambodian. All of them had been promised the exact same thing, but now all of them were being held prisoner. This is the real face of human trafficking. Whilst held captive, the conditions were tightly controlled. It reminds me of a controlling or abusive partner's behaviour. Their passports were taken, their phones were monitored. Some of them had tried to contact their families by sending text messages, but every message was checked before it was sent. A single wrong word could mean punishment. The woman told the police that at first they were treated well. They were fed and given beds to sleep in, but soon the procedures began. They were given injections, a series of shots every single day. Some of them started feeling sick, nausea, bloating, pain. When they asked what was happening, they were told it was normal, that this was simply a part of the surrogacy process. But then came the extractions. One by one, the women were taken into a room. They were sedated. When they woke up, they were often writhing in pain, exhausted, as if something had been drained from them. It happened again and again and again. Some of the women had been there for months. Some had lost count of how many times they'd been taken into that room. Endless procedures, an endless cycle of eggs being taken. These women were not free to leave, but there was a way that they could escape. If they were desperate enough, they were given a choice. They could pay a ransom or stay forever. Some women had families back home who could send them money. Others had nothing. No way out. The woman that escaped had to pay a ransom of 70,000 baht, or around $2,000. And luckily, she was able to raise the alarm as to what was really happening there. And it was completely crazy. Her story was just the beginning of a huge conspiracy. When authorities raided the facility, they expected to find a small-scale operation. What they uncovered, though, was something much worse. They found 100 women, all held prisoner, all subjected to the same endless cycle of medical procedures. Investigators searched the rooms. They found stacks of medical records. There was names, dates, and evidence of dozens of procedures performed on each woman. The truth was undeniable. This was never about surrogacy. This was about harvesting human eggs, over and over again. The women described what they had been through. Daily hormone injections, stomach cramps, swelling. Some felt constant pain, but they were told to simply endure it, that it was normal, that it would pass. The longer the women stayed, the more dangerous it got for them. Some were developing serious complications from the prolonged cycle of medicines, with some feeling that their bodies were simply shutting down. The woman that escaped was, in this scenario, lucky. Her family were able to send the $2,000 for her to escape. However, for those who didn't have access to that large sum of money, they would be indefinitely locked away in this human egg farm. They had no way out. Investigators found evidence that these eggs had been sold, but no records of where they'd gone, who had bought them, what clinics had processed them, how many families had unknowingly used eggs taken from trafficked women. The deeper authorities dug, the more disturbing the questions became. How long had this been happening? How many women had already been used and discarded? And maybe the most chilling question of all, who was behind this? The raid exposed the horrifying truth that this was not an isolated case of human trafficking. It was part of something much larger. The global demand for human eggs has skyrocketed in recent years. Fertility clinics, private buyers, and underground brokers are all willing to pay top dollar for viable eggs. However, legal egg donation is a slow and expensive process. Many countries have strict regulations. There's background checks, medical screenings, mandatory waiting periods. So for those who don't want to wait, or who are simply willing to look the other way, there is another option: the black market. In countries where oversight is weaker, illegal egg harvesting operations can thrive. Traffickers can lure vulnerable women in with promises of high-paying surrogacy jobs. Once inside the system, they are controlled, manipulated, and then forced into medical procedures that they may barely understand. The women at the Georgian facility weren't just victims of trafficking. They were part of an underground supply chain, a system designed to extract and sell their eggs to the highest bidder. Investigators uncovered evidence that suggests that eggs were being funneled into private fertility clinics, some possibly operating in completely legal spaces, unaware of where the eggs had actually come from, and others, of course, simply may not have cared. Egg trafficking rings like this can't operate in isolation. They require doctors willing to perform the procedures, brokers who can move the product, and clients willing to pay. And with desperate people on all sides of the equation, whether they ask questions or not might depend on how desperate they truly are. And this case is horrifying, but it isn't unique. Similar operations have been uncovered in Cambodia, Russia, and other parts of Eastern Europe, and in each case, the same terrifying realization emerges. For each facility that gets shut down, others are still out there. They're still operating, still harvesting, still using trafficked women as nothing more than a resource. Bank records trace payments moving through multiple countries, transactions linked to fertility brokers, private clinics, and offshore accounts. But where these eggs had actually gone, that was harder to prove. Many of the traffickers fled before they could be caught, and those arrested refused to talk. And the fertility clinics suspected of using these eggs, many simply denied involvement, and others disappeared. For the women who had been rescued, freedom came with its own price. Many will suffer long-term health complications, things like hormonal imbalances and damage to their reproductive systems. Some of them may never be able to conceive again, and psychologically the scars will run even deeper. These women had been promised a better life, and instead they've been treated as products, used, drained, and discarded when they were no longer profitable. Some returned home, and others had nowhere to go. No money, no support system, and no justice. And the traffickers who exploited them, it's believed the operation was being run by a Chinese organised crime gang, and the clinics that used these stolen eggs, the families who had unknowingly benefited from these women's suffering, they would probably never even know the truth. And if they did, then they obviously didn't care anyway. This wasn't the first operation of its kind, and it won't be the last. Right now, in countries all over the world, women are still being lured in with a promise of surrogacy, only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of forced egg harvesting. The demand is too high, and the money involved is too large. You can imagine using a mixture of untraceable social media accounts, along with using cryptocurrency as payments. Nobody would ever know any of this happened. For every trafficking ring that gets exposed, there are others still operating in the shadows, new victims being recruited, more eggs being taken, more lives being destroyed. This case pulled back the curtain on a dark hidden industry, but the real question remains: how many more victims are out there, and how many will never be found? In some families, there's nothing more divisive than money. And for some of the more depraved minds out there, money can even be a motive to do things that most of us would never even consider, not for a moment. Discussing inheritance can often be a tumultuous subject, one that can upset family dynamics. And it seems that in this case, it would set some very cold and calculated wheels into motion. What follows is a plot that is almost too insane to be real, but I can assure you, today's dark case is not fiction. It is a disturbing reality. Thomas Kwan was a 53-year-old general practitioner, or GP. If you're watching from the States, which about 65% of you are, a GP is the equivalent of a family doctor or a primary care physician. Thomas lived with his wife and child in a £300,000 house in Teesside. Thomas lived a comfortable life and had a good salary. He had a lot of savings too and was doing financially well for himself. He'd recently put in an offer of £2 million for a new home. So yeah, he was doing okay. Thomas Kwan was an experienced doctor. He had a GP surgery that was based in Sunderland. In 2021, Thomas's mother wrote a will that would set some bizarre events in motion. She decided that she would be leaving a share in a Newcastle home to her partner, Patrick O'Hara. The pair were now both in their 70s and had been together for 20 years. So Mother Jenny decided the home should go to him before her son and his siblings would later inherit it. But upon learning of this detail, Thomas became estranged from his mother. In early January 2024, Patrick O'Hara received a letter from the NHS Community Care Initiative informing him that he qualified for a home nursing visit due to his age. Patrick was pleased to qualify as it saved him a trip to the surgery, and as he was in advancing years, it was more important than ever to prioritise his health. A few days later, he received a second letter to tell him that nurse Raj Patel would be coming to the address that he shared with his partner in Newcastle, and he'd be doing this on the 22nd of that month to perform a routine health check, to collect a few samples for testing and to administer a COVID booster. And so the day came for the home visit. Nurse Patel arrived at the home. He was wearing a hat, a surgical mask, gloves and tinted glasses. He was welcomed into the house. He entered the living room and conducted a medical questionnaire, speaking in a broken English Asian accent. He then took Patrick's blood pressure and urine samples and finally administered the jab, a jab that would change Patrick and Jenny's lives forever. Patrick felt pain in his arm immediately. It was so bad that he reportedly yelled, "Blow." However, he was assured by Nurse Patel that pain during the procedure wasn't uncommon, and so after just 45 minutes in their home, the nurse made a quick exit. Something about the visit was very strange, but at the time, the couple couldn't put their finger on what the issue was. The pain in Patrick's arm got worse and worse, bad enough in fact to visit the hospital. While he was there, it was determined that his pain was simply a case of it being a clumsily administered injection, and so hoping the ordeal was over, Patrick and Jenny returned home. However, the following day, the arm now had blisters, and the level of pain had increased considerably. With the unusual pain that he was experiencing and concern growing after contacting their GP, Patrick returned to A&E with Jenny. This time, the pair showed the staff the letters that had been sent about their scheduled home appointment. But strangely, no one at the hospital had ever heard of the NHS organisation mentioned in the correspondence. Suspicions that something strange was going on began to grow. After deeming the letters as bogus, the staff quickly realised that something was very, very wrong. They immediately contacted Northumbria Police. Staff at the hospital worked hard to ease Patrick's pain, trying desperately to find out what had been injected into his arm so that they could effectively treat the problem. It was no easy task. All they knew was that Patrick had been injected with an unknown toxin. A wound formed around Patrick's arm at the injection site, and he began to display signs of necrotizing fasciitis, a rare flesh-eating bacterial infection and one that is often fatal. Initially, the medical experts suspected ricin, but it was later confirmed to be iodomethane, a pesticide ingredient. Patrick spent a total of 5 weeks in intensive care. He was forced to undergo several surgeries and skin grafts. Surgeons had to remove large portions of flesh from his arm repeatedly. It got to the point where his only real option was amputation to control the infection, a desperate act to stop it from spreading any further. Patrick would say that he felt like a shell of his former self, stating that he had been to hell and back. Jenny and Patrick thought back over the events surrounding the day of the injection, the pain that the injection caused, along with the demeanour of the nurse, Raj Patel, would cause Patrick to remark that the nurse was actually the same height as Jenny's son, Thomas. However, there wasn't too much else to go on as Nurse Patel was wearing PPE. His face was mainly covered by his mask and his eyeglasses were tinted too. Regardless of their suspicions rumbling under the surface, police needed something concrete to bring Raj Patel to justice. However, there was one major issue. Raj Patel could not be found. It was as if he was a ghost that had vanished into the ether. Police launched an investigation, one which would lead them through some complex territory. But no matter how deeply they dove looking for Raj Patel, it only led them back to one other shocking place. The reality of this case is absolutely insane. The perpetrator had taken several cunning steps to try and cover his tracks, and his meticulous measures would all come to light during his trial, when investigators shared the hurdles that they had come up against. Sometimes very meticulously planned crimes do go cold or remain unsolved, but despite the twisted nurse's best efforts, Northumbria Police caught up with him just 2 days after he had donned his wild disguise and given Patrick a poisonous shot. That's right, a disguise. Raj Patel did not exist. He was a creation of none other than Thomas Kwan. Thomas painted his face, donned different glasses, wore a full wig and glued on a beard and mustache too, a plan so simple and so ludicrous, it is hard to imagine that it worked. Almost. The plan was so brash that it could be mistaken as genius. However, although it was well planned, Thomas's methods were pretty amateurish, as though they had been lifted from a movie script. Police used CCTV recordings to track Nurse Raj's movements after leaving the couple's home. The assailant was seen travelling to and arriving at a Premier Inn, a budget hotel chain, that he had checked into earlier that day under a false name. He had also switched the number plates on his car while travelling to Newcastle as an extra measure. It would later be learned that the GP had booked himself a 4-day holiday from work, but he wasn't escaping to the sun or going camping in the mountains. It was purely for his deceptive plan to be carried out. Police also said that he had bought an alternative SIM card, and using this, he messaged his victim confirming his appointment 1 day prior to the event. His home was descended upon in full force by police. Thomas Kwan was under arrest and in police custody. Even with his methods in place, the police were able to gather a ton of evidence against the 53-year-old GP. It's believed that Thomas had begun planning this as far back as November 2023. Kwan's colleagues must have been in utter disbelief when they learned of the lengths that the Hong Kong-born doctor went through to plan his attack, and must have been appalled by its horrific consequences. The man who worked in a trusted profession used tools that were readily available to him, and he did something unimaginable. The motives behind the once trusted health professional's decisions were fueled by one thing: greed. In court, the jury would hear of the calculated efforts Thomas went to. To accompany his forged NHS letters, Thomas had also created a false NHS ID, bearing the alias name Raj Patel. It featured a photo of himself sporting a wig and fake facial hair. Patrick and Jenny had been so welcoming of the NHS nurse on the day of the visit, and they were relaxed enough in their home that they never even asked to see any ID. And perhaps this is something that we should all take a moment to consider. Ask for ID in any situation similar to this one, and tell any elderly relatives to do the same. It was also eventually revealed that this hadn't been Thomas's first time of forging official-looking correspondence either. He had previously created convincing solicitors' letters to threaten his siblings after he didn't get as much as he had expected in his father's will. It seemed that Thomas Kwan's only real drive in life was money. However, it is important to note that even with the will in place, Thomas stood to inherit almost half of his mother's estate, of which the house was only a part. And crazily, if Thomas had succeeded with his poisoning attempt and gone undetected, the financial gains would have been very insignificant compared to the considerable amount he already stood to inherit anyway. Later, the jury would learn some of the more disturbing points of the case. Upon searching the GP's home, which he shared with his partner and child, authorities found that Thomas's garage was stocked with toxins. Toxins such as liquid mercury, thallium, sulfuric acid, and arsenic. There was also other equipment that could be used for producing poisons. Among the ingredients found were castor beans, which contain ricin, something that I learned from Breaking Bad. Most damningly, they found a syringe containing the very same pesticide that had been used to injure Patrick. A total rookie mistake for someone who had gone to such lengths. Investigators also found that Thomas had an extensive amount of research materials, which disturbingly included manuals used by terrorists. His computer housed downloads for a poisoner's handbook, as well as a guidebook that detailed murder investigations. His digital footprint did him no favours either. His search history revealed videos for creating iodomethane, and there were in fact over 100 searches during the month of January related to the substance, along with searches about ricin. The sweep also revealed that he did have a plan B. Police found forged letters offering Patrick free drinks and meals from a fake charity. Another creepy revelation was the fact that Thomas had remotely installed software on his estranged mother's computer around a year before so that he could spy on their computer activities. Thankfully, regardless of his encyclopedic poisoning knowledge and forgery attempts, Thomas's plan didn't go the way that he thought it would. He stood trial in October of 2024, initially insisting that he had no intentions of taking Patrick's life, trying to tell people that he only wanted him to suffer. However, most of the evidence stacked against him made things pretty clear, and unsurprisingly, he eventually changed his plea to guilty. His warped and distorted view of the world shone through in subsequent letters which he sent whilst on remand in prison to his wife. In one such letter, he shared his thoughts on Mr. O'Hara being awarded compensation. The following quote from that letter reveals his twisted mind. "One old man's compensation for 3 young lives ruined. Where's the justice in that?" Thomas Kwan will no longer be able to practice medicine, and it's unlikely he'll see freedom again until he's in his 70s. And we should take some comfort in the fact that Patrick still has his life, despite the countless torturous life-saving surgeries he had to endure, and all at the hands of his partner's money-obsessed son. Jenny still has the man she loves, and there is one less monster on the streets.
It's never gonna go back to how it was. I mean, that's the hardest thing to realize. Is there's no recovering fully. It's not like, oh, I'm gonna get better and then I'll go home and everything will go back to how it was. It's not that. It's never been that. Oh God. I'm so tired. Everything is exhausting and overwhelming.
Jasmine stood in front of the mirror. Her eyes were locked on the legs that reflected back at her. They looked like hers. They had always been hers. But something inside her already knew these limbs no longer belonged to her in the way that they used to. She whispered an apology to her own reflection. "I'm so sorry this happened. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." This thing had no mercy, no pattern, just a creeping, calcifying certainty. Bone where bone should not be. A second skeleton forming inside her own body. Now, every single movement is a risk, and worst of all, it was only just beginning. In the fall of 1998, Jasmine was 5 years old, and she was getting ready to start kindergarten. Her family had just moved across the country from Wisconsin to Connecticut for her father's new job. The boxes were barely unpacked. Everything felt new and full of promise. Then one morning, Jasmine complained of a stiff neck. Her parents chalked it up to a bad sleeping position, but by the end of the day, Jasmine's neck was tilted in an unnatural position. She couldn't seem to straighten it out. Within weeks, her parents were sitting across from their 4th doctor, asking a question that no parent should ever have to ask. Is something seriously wrong with our daughter? And devastatingly, the answer was yes. In January of 1999, Jasmine was diagnosed with fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, or FOP, otherwise known as Munchmeyer disease. This is a name that almost nobody has heard of, a disease so rare that it only affects about 1 in every 2 million people worldwide. It was impossible to explain, a condition that turns soft tissue, muscle, ligaments and tendons into real bone, not bone-like tumours or growths. We are talking actual bone. The family now knew that Jasmine's body would slowly and silently entomb itself. She would have to be extremely careful to avoid any injuries. She could not have vaccines, and she must avoid surgery. Even a simple fall could trigger irreversible damage. Jasmine's life and the life of her family had now changed, and changed forever. Devastatingly, the countdown had started. FOP is one of the rarest and most terrifying diseases known to medicine. It starts slowly, usually with malformed big toes at birth, and then, normally sometime before the age of 10, the real horror begins. People with FOP would notice a small lump, perhaps some inflammation, and then the bone growth creeps in. It doesn't grow in places where bone should be. Instead, it replaces those muscles, ligaments, and tendons. This can really be anywhere on the body, even between ribs or across joints. Jasmine's disease was caused by a spontaneous mutation in a gene called ACVR1. That gene is responsible for managing how the body grows bone. In a healthy person, this gene switches off after birth, but in someone like Jasmine, it just never stops.
My name is Jasmine. I was diagnosed with FOP when I was 5.5 years old. It started from my neck and then shoulders, and then my back started having lesions on it. Scoliosis started forming. The most important thing for me with my independence through the years has been traveling by myself. I love to have new adventures and feeling independent. I would just love to not have that fear of, not being able to walk someday.
Her body responds to even the smallest injury by trying to heal. But instead of repairing the soft tissue, it instead creates new bone in its place. New and permanent bone. Bone that, when x-rayed, shows up white just like all the others. And once it's there, it will not go away. Every movement that once brought joy, a cartwheel, a stretch, even a hug, now becomes a minefield. Because trauma, even microscopic, can activate the disease. Surgery is not an option. Trying to remove the bone growth only causes more to grow. The very act of healing actually has a negative effect. Over time, people with FOP develop what doctors call a second skeleton. Bones wrap around their joints. It fuses into their tissue, then locking them in place. It often begins in the upper body, neck, shoulders and back, and then creeps downwards. By the time most patients are adults, they're living inside their own prison. Many are unable to open their mouths, or perhaps their mouths would be stuck open. It's not unusual to not be able to move your head at all. Breathing freely can become a real issue when your ribs no longer expand. The disease does not affect the heart, diaphragm or tongue, which is a small mercy. However, it eventually compromises the lungs. That's why the average lifespan of someone with FOP is only around 40 years old. And as of now, there is no cure. At first, at such a young age, Jasmine did not understand what was happening. She just knew that she had to be more careful. No climbing in the playground. She could no longer take gym class. And there was definitely no more roughhousing. For a while though, the disease was quiet, but the knowledge of it sat in the back of her mind, like a looming and shadowy figure. Her parents tried to stay hopeful, but the fear was always there. In one of her early diary entries, Jasmine wrote, "What must it be like to not have to worry about your body growing new bone, to raise your arms above your head, to bend down to tie your shoes? What's it even like to sit cross-legged?" And those questions weren't rhetorical or based in anything other than reality. They were grief in real time. As her classmates learned to jump rope and run races, Jasmine instead had to learn how to calculate risk, how to not fall over at all costs, and how to live with the constant dread of movement itself. No child should ever have to become their own caretaker, but Jasmine was forced to be her own protector, because she was the only person that would always be ever present. She was only 6 years old when she realized her life would always be different, that her body had betrayed her, and that one wrong step could change everything. For most people, the body changes gradually with age, but for Jasmine, change came in violent and irreversible waves. Her diary became an outlet. On February the 28th, 2019, she posted, "The more I look at you, the more I miss you. I know I appreciated you while you were here. I just wasn't ready to lose you so soon. This is really scary for me, needing to force myself to adapt to how my body is now. I feel nearly broken without you. I'm grieving you. My movements don't feel like my own." What she wrote here was no poetic metaphor. She was literally grieving the ability to walk, to sit without pain, to move freely.
Okay, I'm gonna try to explain what's been going on this entire year. It was completely unexpected. It started way back in February, so it was probably like the second week of the month, and I was actually with my boyfriend, kind of like a mini vacation, which is local to me, but kind of just like a little getaway. And all of a sudden, I woke up with severe pain in my right thigh. And for some reason, just because of the type of pain, I knew immediately that it was a flare-up, but I had no idea how serious it really was. So, like, over that week and the next couple of weeks, my leg was getting really swollen, and it was very concerning. I ended up having 2 ultrasounds of my leg, which was very strange because I never have had an ultrasound on my leg before. But thankfully I didn't have any blood clots or anything. And then it wasn't until it was April, so I went from February to April just with a very swollen leg. Tried to continue with my life, kind of tried to not worry about it too much, and hope that it was going to resolve itself and the flare-up would end. And then in mid-April, I started having severe pain in my lower back on the right side, and my right leg was still bothering me, still very swollen. But the pain in my back was preventing me from breathing very well, and I already have a restricted lung capacity, so this was very scary. I would wake up from sleeping and I'd be gasping for air, and we ended up having to call an ambulance to bring me to the local hospital because for one thing, I couldn't physically get into a car.
During a thigh flare-up in March of 2019, she made a list, standing at concerts, curling up in bed, kneeling, sitting without pain, getting up from the couch, walking short distances, showering in a tub. All of them had become nearly impossible. Then came the entry from July the 4th. I looked into the full-length mirror, my legs visible, and my heart instantly broke. The person staring back at me was unfamiliar. I apologized over and over to the scared girl's reflection. I'm so sorry this happened. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. Even her self-image had started to splinter, and yet Jasmine's voice has never disappeared. On the 1-year anniversary of losing significant mobility, she wrote, "A year later, I feel less like I can't believe this is happening to me, and more like everything is really challenging and tiring now, but it's not the end of my life. I'm still the same person. I found beauty in my pain."
Just never imagined myself in this setting. I never thought I'd be at a nursing facility surrounded by elderly residents and having basically 24/7 care whenever I need it. And just seeing how much my body has changed in this amount of time is just really, it just blows my mind. I just have never seen my body change so quickly. Even when I got here in May, I was able to bend my left knee. Now I can't.
What had once felt like a nightmare was becoming her new normal, and somehow, even in the midst of that, Jasmine still found moments of strength. She still never lost who she was, and honestly, she's awesome, regardless of how much her body isn't playing ball. In May of 2019, Jasmine was admitted to UMass Medical Center. She thought it would be temporary, just a few days, maybe a week at a stretch, but she ended up staying for 7. In a diary entry dated June the 24th, she wrote, "This is so surreal, having to see everyone's lives go on, and I'm stuck in this room." Someone had tried to encourage her to go outside, to leave the hospital walls. But what they couldn't understand is that outside wasn't safe anymore. trying to live a fuller life, could cause a devastating flare-up. The hospital room became her bubble. Claustrophobic, yes, but also the only place that she could truly feel protected. Earlier that spring, she'd been rushed to the ER after gasping for air in her sleep. CT scans showed a bleed in her lower back, and the trauma of those few days, ice chips only, no food or water, no sleep, left her drained. But the worst part of it all wasn't even the pain, it was the uncertainty. No one knew when or if the flare-ups would stop. No one could say how much more mobility she would lose. And every hospital stay came with a terrifying risk. More trauma could equal more bone. She spends her life fighting an enemy that lives within her own skin. Most grief we experience is from something external. A person may pass away, a relationship could end, something is lost in the world around you, but you carry on the same. But Jasmine experienced a different kind of grief, one that happened from the inside out. In her entry from February 28, 2023, 4 years after her world had shifted, she wrote, "At times it feels like I'm drifting further from myself. I feel so far away from where I used to be and where I want to be. It's unsettling to face so many unknowns without reprieve." FOP hasn't just taken her mobility, it took the familiarity that we all take for granted. It's forced her to watch her own body become something that she didn't recognize nor could she trust. And she's missed things that most people never even think about. Turning her head to look at someone, washing her own hair, sitting on the floor cross-legged, raising up her arms in celebration, looking up at the stars. In an older entry, she wrote, "What's it like to not be imprisoned by bone? That's what I want to know." But through all of this, Jasmine held on to one core truth, one final defiance against a disease that wanted to define her. I know I'm not my body. I'm my soul, my thoughts, feelings, words. I'm smart, creative, friendly. I'm not my limitations.
I don't think there's ever been a more hopeful time for the FOP community. And that is due to the research discoveries that have been made throughout the world.
We know a lot about FOP right now. We have the gene discovery that happened in 2006, so we know the exact gene responsible for this disease.
The discovery of the FOP gene gave a central target for developing therapies. We now have 2 clinical trials in the United States, 1 in Japan, 1 in Europe, and hopefully within the next year, we will have as many as 4 or 5 new clinical trials.
I don't think any of this would have been possible if it wasn't for the efforts of the IFPA, the patients, and their families. We need to use that energy to keep going and not to stop.
Support for research is more important now than ever.
There are yet so many questions that we don't have the answers for. The more funding we have to support the research, to understanding this disease, and to identifying treatment, the faster we can give those drugs to our patients.
As I've said, there is no cure for FOP, but there is research. And there is still Jasmine. Her body may have changed, but her voice has never been louder. Through her writing, through her interviews, her advocacy, and her unshakable honesty, she proves that even if your body does become a cage, your spirit can still break through.
My hope for Jasmine's future is that we have a medication that can stop this continuous onslaught of FOP that continually robs her of independence, of movement, of living a pain-free life.
If I was able to just get used to where I'm at now with my body and not fear that I'm going to lose other mobility, to have that peace of mind, I think that's definitely something that we're praying for.
She hasn't given up. Her life has changed, but she's not given up on being able to live her best life. I want that for her. She deserves that.
Please support the IFOPA so that people with FOP can have more hope for the future.
Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.